is broadcast control. We are ready for broadcast.
CT Politics TV, giving the people what they need. CT Politics TV.
On the air everywhere. Roku, Apple, Amazon Fire.
And at ctpolitics.tv. This is CT Politics TV with Dan Newmeyer.
CT Politics TV, giving the people what they need.
Hello and welcome to CT Politics TV. I'm Dan Newmeyer, and today we are going to meet another one of Connecticut's wonderful state representatives, Representative Eleni Kavros DeGraw of the 17th District. And we're going to talk about some stuff after we meet her and learn a little bit about who she is and her district and what's going on up at the Capitol. About Representative Corey Paris and some of the problems that he found himself in after making a seemingly innocuous post, telling his constituents, hey, be vigilant. ICE has some operations going on here, so everybody be safe. And it blew up into a firestorm. But before that, state representatives encompass so much more than any one issue. Let's bring on Eleni. Hi, Eleni. How are you?
Hi, Dan. Thanks so much for having me. I'm great.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And welcome to CT Politics TV. Tell us, Eleni, about your district. And are you, did you grow up in Connecticut or move here? And how did you come about, and what was your early family like? What did your parents do, and where did you go to school?
Sure. I represent Avon and Canton. That's District 17. I'm really proud to represent it. It's in the Farmington Valley for those who might be viewing this and don't know that, like my mom. No, I'm kidding. but no, I'm so happy to be with you today. And also, it's really exciting to be a state representative in terms of we get to help people every day. And so it's harder for us when we don't get to help people with difficult situations. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I didn't actually grow up in Connecticut. I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia. I was technically born in Honolulu, Hawaii. I often joke it was the same hospital as Barack Obama. Not the same year.
Did you get a birth certificate?
I did get a birth certificate.
And it did Kenya? No.
I used to make that joke that I might have to pack my bags too. But no, it's so I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia. My parents divorced very early. And so my mom and I lived with my grandparents for about 7.5 years. And, as a single mom, it was really difficult. Luckily, we were able to move out when I was about 8 years old to a townhome that was nearby. Up in the north, they call them row houses, but in the south, they're townhouses. And so I was really lucky to have the involvement of my grandparents early on. And obviously my mom was a flight attendant. She started with Allegheny Airlines and then US Air. And then eventually, after many mergers, she retired as an American Airlines flight attendant. She did remarry when I was in high school, which was wonderful. But my grandparents had such a strong hand in raising me. My grandfather was actually an IAM machinist and did that for many, many years, mediator, arbitrator. He believed in the power of making sure that everybody had what they needed in terms of if they were having a problem at work, which often ended up in them potentially losing their jobs. He wanted to make sure that, they had the assistance they needed. So he was actually an early adopter, early proponent of the employee assistance programs that help people, get over addiction, get through tough times at home, that sort of thing.
So that must have been inspiring to see, because I was a union organizer back in the day, and it's it's a tough gig and a lot of personalities, and this is serious stuff. People's lives, their livelihoods, they're taking care of their families, lots on the line, and that can be contentious. But it's seeing your father do this. Did that inspire you to? Where was the switch? I mean, I can see the stewardess genetics in your. You always have a career there, so that's right. Fly the friendly skies,
right?
But but I mean, those are powerful influences. My mother, I remember, hanging on her her skirt while she was making calls for League of Women Voters,
Yeah.
and just just you get it through osmosis almost.
My family was definitely involved in politics, but on the volunteer side, not, nobody ran for
Sure.
office. My grandfather loved to stand the polls every year. My mom was definitely involved with the flight attendants union. And so, I learned a lot about that. I mean, I definitely was on picket lines as a kid whenever one of the airlines would go out on strike. And I remember that so deeply. And growing up in Alexandria, Virginia, it's the DC area. And I used to say, that they put the IV in when you're born to pay attention to national news, not just local news, to pay attention to politics. And much of our local news was national news. So I think that, I've always paid attention. I majored in English in college, but I was, a journalist right out of college. I did a lot in the DC area around the military. I come from a family of people who served. My husband was in the Navy. My grandfather was in the Navy. My biological father was in the Navy. So we certainly have a proud tradition in the family of paying attention to things like that. But I would also say I have a great uncle who helped write the Americans with Disabilities Act. He was actually appointed by the first George Bush. I got to see him sworn in by Quayle when I was in middle school, Vice President Quayle. And we were very proud of him for working on that, specifically around workforce development. That was his sort of niche. He was out in Indiana, but he was very focused on disability workforce development, the most underutilized population for employment that we have.
That in itself is inspiring, but I can just, I see the whole Union strong organizing spirit there. Absolutely. So, after high school, what did you do, and when did the spark come that like public service was going to be the bane of your existence?
Well, I wouldn't say the bane, more
No.
like my honor and pleasure. But
Sure.
I went to college at James Madison University in Virginia. It was an in-state school. It was relatively inexpensive, and so that was the goal at that point was just trying to get through those 4 years, and trying to make sure that I didn't come out with student loan debt and all those good things that people are so worried about right now. And then after that, I had actually met my husband. He'd started a company here in Connecticut. Like I said, he's a veteran. He's actually was discharged, a disabled veteran. And so he started a business here. And I joke, if I wanted him, I had to move. So we came to, I came to Connecticut, and then we got married and started our family here, decided this was where we really wanted to build our lives. And I'm so grateful for that. Connecticut has really been wonderful for my family. And then, I stayed home with my children because frankly, childcare was so crazy expensive. I was very earlier in my career. My husband was more established, and it looked like my salary would go entirely to commuting, wardrobe, daycare, childcare, so we decided as a family that I would stay home and be with the kids. And then as they started to go to school, I was getting more and more involved in their schools. You hear the story about the PTA moms who run for office. I sort of was that mom. I also served on many boards for, one of my favorites was Hands on Hartford. I served on that board for 7 years, really was very entrenched in their early backpack program, providing backpacks full of food for kids in the Hartford Public Schools. That was the first program of its kind in the nation. Was also involved with a truancy prevention project that they had with the Junior League, Center City Churches, which was the name at the time before they became Hands on Hartford, and also the Children's Trust Fund. So I tried to keep my hand in the things that were of interest to me. And, for my entire life, I've worked on the issues of hunger and homelessness. And so to me, those were issues that I really wanted to be able to affect here in the state of Connecticut, even, as a volunteer, as a board member, that sort of thing.
Then at what point did the seat open up, or did you decide to run, or were you recruited in this thing where like, we need somebody? And it's like, and it's around like
kind of a funny story. So I was one of those women that got upset after the 2016 election, and I had
with Jillian.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily with Jillian. I actually didn't know Jillian at the time. We are good friends now, but I did not know her at the time. But I was one of those women. I actually ended up on the cover of the New Yorker. It was a picture of the United States of America, and each state had a woman's little head, and my little head ended up there for 2018. In 2016, I went to our Democratic Town Committee, and I said, okay, so like, how do you get involved? My interest was in being a volunteer and trying to support other candidates. Then I found out that the state representative seat had not been challenged by anyone in 4 years. We were represented by a very nice man. But I thought that maybe, we could find someone with a little bit more vim and vigor. And so I kept asking people, like, do you want to run for office? Do you want to run for office? And they kept saying, no, I think it's you. And I kept saying, no, it's not me. At the time, I had a 7-year-old, our youngest was 7. And I had, a daughter in middle school and a daughter in high school. And that was not on my bingo card in terms of running for office. And then finally, they say women have to be asked an average of 13 times in order to run for office. And so finally, I sat with my family and said, what do you think about this? I had ended up running the municipal campaign as their campaign manager in Avon. And that was taking up a lot of time. So my family kind of had a preview of what it would look like when I ran for office. I ran in 2018. I was not successful. The gentleman who was in the seat actually retired. So it was an open seat. And I ran against a lovely woman, Leslie Hill. She ended up beating me in November by just around 100 votes. And then I came back in 2020. I ran again and I won by, I think it was over 500. And now I'm in my 3rd term.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. And that's, that's more typical than you might think, where, people are like, all right, who are we going to get to run for this seat? And everybody's like, you're doing it. No, not me. I mean, who of you, and then this kind of goes on. And then all of a sudden you're like, all right, I'm going to do it, but then you lose, even though you put in this huge effort. But it's close. But now people know your name. Now you've been out there. Now you know how to do it, right?
And then COVID hits.
Oh, God. Yeah.
No, and it's funny you mentioned Jillian, because Jillian knocked an unbelievable amount of doors during the primary. And then after the fact, someone at State Party told me that actually I knocked more doors than Jillian in 2018 in order to try to get elected, because I started in March, and frankly, I had to. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have, I wasn't a known quantity. I wasn't somebody who everybody in the community knew me. So I really had to work very, very, very hard. And I will say, to all the volunteers I've ever had, but especially to those early believers in me and in my ability to make change, those 2018 volunteers, they worked the hardest you can imagine. And so many of them still volunteer for me and are still on my team, which I am very, very lucky to have.
That's a wonderful story. So now you're the state rep, and you go from kind of normal life to 50%, or now it's down to 30% of the people that really don't agree.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're in the fishbowl with everybody else. And now there's 150 or so state reps. You're trying to come and build consensus and stuff like that. Did you sponsor legislation out of the gate, or co-sponsor stuff? And how was your initiation into it? Was it overwhelming, or what did you think?
I will say, on one hand, it felt like 10 fire hoses at the same time in terms of information. And also remember, like I said, it was COVID. My class was sworn in on actual January 6th, 2021.
Outside,
at the time,
right?
Yes, outside. At the time when I was raising my hand, I couldn't even hear what the Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, was saying, because the protesters, we had about 500 protesters that were screaming, "We're coming for you." I didn't mind when they said, "You work for us," because we absolutely do work for the people. But it got a little different. And then when, finding out after the fact what was going on in DC was a little sketchy, to say the least. But I was very lucky. I came in, I was asked to be vice chair of finance, revenue, and bonding. So I got to serve in that capacity. I immediately sponsored a bill to remove the personal income tax from IRAs. The legislature in the previous, I believe, maybe 1 or 2 sessions before my getting there, they had taken it off of 401ks and pensions, but IRAs were left out because it was another significant tax loss. I think it was around $30 million, but I was able to pass that as a freshman and was very, happy to do so. I've co-sponsored.
And who wouldn't like that?
Right. Who wouldn't like that? That was a very
cutting taxes, and everybody's on board.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And we're, I've continued to work, certainly in a bipartisan manner. I work with a lot of my Republican colleagues on bills. You can ask any of them. They will absolutely say that. I am lucky to now be the chair of planning and development. I became a chair as a sophomore. And now we're in our, junior term, so to speak. And I love the work, and I love being able to do this. it's an honor.
That's a wonderful story too. I think there was an exodus during the COVID, right? There were the people who were like, I'm not sticking around for this.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of new people coming in at that time, but it was a very difficult time for everyone. And especially for legislators trying to negotiate what's the right thing to do. And I think the governor, in my opinion, did a very good job. And I think his popularity reflects that. But there are people who think he's the worst of the worst of the worst and did the wrong thing. And so you can't please everybody all the time.
Certainly
There's some
not.
people, who are always going to be suspicious and all that other stuff. So they're not generally people who can come to a consensus on things. So now you're the state rep, and have you moved into any leadership roles, or is that on your radar to head towards?
So I really wanted to chair a committee because I am sort of a policy wonk. And so that's, to me, that's the best place to be in terms of guiding policy. And so as a sophomore, I did, put in a little bug in the speaker's ear, if anything comes open, I'd love to be a chair. And I've already been a vice chair for 2 years. And so, so now this is my second term that I have chaired the Planning and Development Committee. It used to be Planning, Development, and Housing. Years ago, they pulled housing out of it to give someone else a chair. And so now it's Planning and Development. We deal with basically anything related to municipalities. So it could be everything from newspaper notices to zoning to taxation. It's a really broad committee in terms of cognizance. And it's been really fascinating to dig in on all of the issues that committee oversees.
Do the COG the COG entities overlap in that? I think
absolutely. No,
sounds like they'd be all over that.
Yeah, we are so lucky to have our councils of government, and they are wonderful organizations that are so useful to our towns, especially some of our smaller towns that don't have the capacity for full-time staff. That's where some of the COGs can come in and be really useful and help them figure things out. And we don't like the concept of regionalization so much in Connecticut, but these sort of we don't have county government either, but these COGs represent sort of coalitions within the state that are able to think regionally without regionalizing, so to speak. But, things like if you were to buy, say we have to buy a new dispatch system in Avon, it would be much better if, Simsbury's purchasing one at the same time, and so is Farmington. We have more purchasing power if we do that together. It's the same with like the chemicals we use on the roads. You want to be able to purchase that sort of regionally or even statewide so that you can save money for the taxpayer.
Yeah, you get the economies of scale. Matt Hart is a friend of mine.
Great guy.
I live out in Mansfield, so he ran the show down here for quite a while before moving on. I think now is a good time to probably kind of shift into why I asked you on today, and Representative Corey Paris made a post to let his community know that ICE was investigating in the district and that people should be vigilant, and gave some phone numbers in case there was, a legal issue or something like that. And it seemed pretty innocuous to me. When I read it, I was like, it wasn't
very
a big
generic
deal to me. But wow, that it took off. And I think I think it was ICE that kind of picked up the thing and said, hey, DOJ, take a look at this or something. And it set off a firestorm of people who believed that Corey had doxed ICE agents or was interfering in what they were doing or something like that. And my understanding of it was it was already underway, and he was reacting to this news that this was all going on. Can you shed some light into that, into how people responded, and then what the reality of the situation was? I think that, there's a lot of people out there who are still confused and still saying he did this or he did that. And it's just not the case.
I think some of the confusion actually stems from the use of the word dox. if you look up what doxing is, and sometimes when I say to people, oh, I got doxed because I did as a result of this, for speaking out on behalf of Corey, and other people have been doxed, you have to actually share someone's personal information. So for instance, if you were doxed, it would mean that someone was sharing, say, your home address, your schedule of where you might be, the addresses of your children's schools, really highly personal information, right? Something that the public wouldn't ordinarily know.
That's what I always thought it was.
Yes. And so when people said that Representative Paris doxed ICE, again, going back to the original post, I believe Stamford has around 80,000 people in Stamford. I don't know how many miles of roads and streets that Stamford has, but when he generically said, be vigilant, meaning like, keep an eye out, look in on your neighbors kind of thing. He said it for Stamford. He did not share an address of where ICE was, which again would not be doxing even if he did. He especially didn't share the names or the addresses or any personal information about these ICE agents. And remember, up to 70% of the people so far that have been detained and or deported by ICE, up to 70% are not even people who have criminal records. This has not been the operation that we had hoped it would be in terms of, yes, we don't want rapists and murderers wandering around the streets and having the ability to commit more crimes. But the reality is that you are taking people who are just a father. Yesterday hearing a story about a woman whose husband was taken from one of the courthouses and doesn't have a criminal record. He is their primary means of support. This woman and her daughter are now going to lose their house, and the woman herself is an American citizen. These are the kinds of stories that we hear over and over again. And unfortunately, as state representatives and state senators, there's not a lot we can do other than to warn people when we know they're in a certain area, or to say, keep an eye out, that sort of thing, because it's very difficult to get information after people have been taken.
One of the things that I think is hard, and I think, I have to take the devil's advocate here,
of course,
for some, is that, during the Biden administration, Americans kind of watched the flood of humanity coming into the country. And the national rhetoric kind of went back and forth. Well, we need a bipartisan bill. Nothing else can be done. We're trying to help these people as best we can. But in actuality, people were coming in and being released into the interior and subsidized so they weren't starving or dying or in the streets and that type of stuff. And the American people never asked for any of that or wanted that. They wanted controlled, measured border and what we've always said that we wanted. When in converse, we need labor, we take advantage of new immigrants and everything. So there's a flip side to the whole thing. And that's kind of why it's never, in my mind, been settled. And I've been watching it since 1985 when I lived in Hollywood, California, and knew many people who were, fresh in the country. So now I think people are, they have believed that ICE is deporting and going after the bad people, and we need to get them out of here. But after seeing this, I think Democrats lost a lot of credibility on we just want to get rid of the criminals, and that they're kind of supporting this whole thing. And so now it feels like it's tipped to this point where, well, there are all these good people here and they do help us with our meat packing, with our construction work, with our landscaping work, with childcare.
Hospitality. Yep.
Hospitality was a big one, like in big resorts in Florida that some big politicians own. But, now, it's come time to pay the piper and Trump has, campaigned on this single issue. So in your mind, how do you separate that and say, well, okay, these people overstayed their visas or they have a final deportation order. They're not criminals, but how do we resolve that? Because most people are going to throw up their hands and say, well, what else can we do? Because the law says this.
And I totally agree. For decades, as you said, we've been looking at immigration, right? We were trying to find path to citizenship. We were trying to make this work. I believe Senator Murphy and the senator from Oklahoma, his name just went out of my head, but they had a bipartisan bill that they were planning on putting forward. And then candidate Trump at the time had called the Republicans and said, absolutely not. Oh, I'm sorry. It was Senator Langford. That's who it was, out of
Yep,
Oklahoma.
that's true.
And I know for a fact that he didn't even want to be mentioned during Joe Biden's last State of the Union address for having worked on that bill, because of the political fallout of having worked on that bill. But he and Chris Murphy had a really good plan, a really good bill to both be able to remove criminals and for other people to be able to be on the path to citizenship. And remember, for the laws that are in place, I just watched a video today of a gentleman being escorted after the judge told him that he was moving on to the next aspect of his citizenship, that it was okay for him to stay. And yet ICE pulled him out the second he got in the hallway and said, nope, you're going to be deported. Now, is that going against the law? Because a judge has just said that you're going through the process as you should, the process that we currently have. So what are we supposed to say to those people? What are we supposed to say to the people who are American citizens, who have been pulled over, who have been detained, who it takes them a day or week or months to be able to get out of detention as American citizens, but they're brown? So what about those folks? And I would also say, my personal story, I am a third generation Greek American. I am an American first, but I am also Greek. And both of my grandparents, great grandparents, actually, on both sides, were fleeing genocide from the Ottoman Empire. And that's what we see when people are coming here. They're coming here for a better life. Many of them are fleeing violent countries. Many of them are fleeing dictatorships. I'm not saying that everyone and their brother has to be let in, but there has to be a process. It needs to be, working through legal channels. And again, we've had the opportunity to fix this for decades, regardless of party, and we have chosen not to do it. It is a moral choice, in my opinion, that we have not stood up and said, we are going to fix this, especially for a country that was built on the backs of immigrants.
And I think that, that America likes to make money off the
and have. Yeah.
and then, all these folks who are, paying into the system for Social Security don't reap those benefits.
But billions and billions of dollars that these immigrants pay into the system that they do not get any services out of.
Yeah. I think, no, I completely understand the dilemma that everybody's facing. And I think there's a couple key points that you mentioned. One is due process, right? We have laws and we need to follow them. And that cuts both ways, right? It's for everybody, so we don't end up in this situation.
Correct.
Where people are disappearing and that type of thing.
And it's for all persons, according to the Constitution. I said this in my remarks when we had a press conference about what happened to Representative Paris and how he's been targeted and threatened, and things like they want to execute him, they want to lynch him. I mean, it's beyond just put him in jail.
It was
things
beyond
that have
the pale.
been said.
It was
absolutely beyond the pale. But the Constitution says all persons. It doesn't say all citizens for due process. It says all persons. And that is what we have really missed throughout the last 6 months of watching what we've seen on TV and in Connecticut in terms of these raids.
Well, there's a lot of people who don't understand that the Constitution covers all persons.
Right.
So there's that. I did see a beat-faced red John Larson giving a speech, and he was calling ICE agents Gestapo and Nazis. And I don't know that that's particularly helpful. Have you seen that video?
I have not seen that video. I do think we all need to be very careful in the language that we use that is inflammatory. I think that, in some ways we are seeing things on American streets that we've never seen before, that we've witnessed in other countries, that are horrifying to us. And I think that that is what is leading people to use words like he used, certainly. But I think that we also need to be, as the majority leader said again at that press conference, we all need to be responsible for the things that we are saying as best we can, and try to not further inflame in some situations, because certainly police officers have the right to go home safely. ICE agents have the right to go home safely. I honestly think that politicians and police officers are sort of in the same boat right now and I've heard that from some of our Capitol police officers in terms of, we're not well liked either way, right? But everyone has the right, including politicians, including police officers, to be able to go home to their families. And with all of this inflammatory language and with the, rhetoric of the account that doxed Representative Paris in the first place, it is really, really hard to maintain the civility. And we still we are obligated to try.
Yeah. I mean, all the algorithms just constantly feed people stuff that infuriates them. And it can go really bad like it did in this situation.
Yeah.
You know, what do we do though? I mean, where do we go from here in terms of kind of reeling that back in? And, there's people shoveling coal on this stuff to try and divide us further.
Yeah, I do think some of this is individual responsibility. It's sort of like stop and think before you, maybe just scroll on by in some cases. Like it's not that you can't have an opinion. It's not that you can't be angry or sad or whatever emotion you might be feeling when you see something. But, some of it is fact checking. Some of it is listening to, different news sources. I mean, trying to get a variety of news sources, both from inside our country and outside of our country. I think that sometimes, just hearing the criticism is not a bad thing, right? I have to listen to a lot of criticism. So, you can't believe all the good, you can't believe all the bad, right? But I do think that, some of this is individual responsibility. We cannot control the algorithm. I don't think that these social media sites who are in it to win it in terms of corporate greed and making more money off of our outrage, we're not going to have good partnerships with them, unfortunately. But I do think that we can police our own behavior. And, instead of trolling every single day, I've got one person who chooses to comment on every single post that I make. And that is their right to do that. Absolutely. And also maybe you take a day off. Maybe you think about, maybe you go outside with your kids. Go have a coffee. Yeah. And also, I think it's important to be making these relationships with people who do not agree with you on everything. I mean, that is something that I pride myself on in the building. I may not agree with my Republican colleagues. And I have to say that generally behind the scenes, it is very collegial. I do not feel like we are doing what Washington is doing. It was very disappointing to me to see one of my Republican colleagues retweet some of my comments with a very disparaging remark last week that led to me being doxxed. But generally speaking, I have good friends on the other side of the aisle. And again, I go back to listening to my grandfather on the phone talking about negotiations. I go back to the fact that he sat at a table with the president of Allegheny Airlines. And then at the end of the day, they went out for dinner. They may have been like this in the room, but outside the room, they were friendly and it made a difference. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan used to go out for drinks. I mean, I think that it is possible for us to get back there, but it is an all of us project. It is probably the biggest group project in history for those who.
I think it is. I've been doing this now. This is going into the 4th year. And the whole purpose of this is to, have a longer conversation to understand who you are as a representative, right, what motivates you, what, how you feel on different issues and bring that into people's living rooms to say that, this soundbite and that little quote don't summarize who this person is. It doesn't even give you a clue. And I've been doing panel shows where I bring in the far right, the far left. I got a trans conservative and a trans liberal.
Wow.
And yeah. And it's great. And what happens is the crazy rhetoric drops and people want to try their ideas and come to a consensus on something. What can we agree on? Well, I don't believe in global warming, or I believe in fossil fuels, but we all want clean air, right? Yeah. Okay. We all want
clean water.
We want clean water. Oh, all right. Cheaper electricity. Yeah. Or whatever. But once you start to go issue by issue, a lot of the craziness falls off. So I'm committed to taking the abuse out here in the middle and bringing everyone
I think
together.
most people are in the middle. Pollsters used to say, "Oh, these unaffiliated voters in the middle, they're like unicorns." No, they're not. I'm married to one. Like, they're not unicorns. They are just everyday people who believe, a little bit of fiscal conservativeness and some social liberalness. I mean, they really are out there. And I think that that is, and at the end of the day, reminding people that we're all Americans, we're all, a lot of ways, we're people trying to build families, people trying to get by, people trying to lower the cost of living, so that they can build families here the way that I was lucky to. I think that, again, if we're looking at what we have more in common, and I would also say, because I think it's so important, behind the scenes as a committee chair, right? The Democrats are in charge. So we have all the chair positions. So I'm the chair on the House side. Senator Rahman is the chair on the Senate side for our committee. But we have rankings, Senator Gordon and Representative Zullo. And we sit together and we screen the bills. In the majority of the committees, the Republicans and the Democrats are sitting together, deciding what bills are going to get a hearing, what bills are going to come out of committee. And I really appreciate, and I hope they appreciate this about me, that we're all bringing different skill sets to these conversations. And I hope that that is what is making legislation better, is that, Joe Zullo is a land use attorney. I'm not. Senator Gordon is a doctor, but he also served on his planning and zoning committee in his town for many, many years. And I did not. Senator Rahman is bringing a wealth of what it's like to experience this country as an immigrant and how difficult housing is to get as an immigrant. These are things that I hope that the public understands, that when we get past the sound bites, the real work that is being done in the building is really honest to God, good work between the parties, regardless of who has the most seats and who has the least seats.
And what I try to impress on people out there is that you want to send people forward who can work with other people.
Yes.
Right? They can have whatever, their political vision is on everything, but they need to be able to sit at the table and be able to discuss it civilly. And for the most part, that's what goes on up there. So,
and it is about compromise.
And it doesn't mean that there aren't big disagreements on that last 20%.
Right.
But, the 70%, as Doug Dubitsky would say, is, well, most of that, Dan, is roads and bridges and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and Doug's on my committee. I consider him a friend. We make jokes a lot about theater and other things that I'm sure people would be really surprised about. But I think that, again, we are all up there to represent our individual communities. His community is very different than mine. And you have to be able to hear that voice as well, because your community, right? And your district. And that, with 169 towns and with so many districts, you have to have people who are willing to come forward and say, well, that may work in your district, but it doesn't work in mine. And that's, a lot of where we were on the housing bill, which, we came to a lot of compromise before we passed it. And we're coming to even more compromise. But I think that in the end, bills are better for it. And it's important that we continue to have all of these discussions.
Well, and they should let Governor Lamont go to the YIMBY event.
Well, I am not in charge of the guest list.
No.
But I will be there.
You get to go.
Anyone can go. I mean, it's a difference, I guess, to be invited or not invited, but anyone is able to attend.
Gotcha. Well, Eleni, very nice to meet you finally, and welcome to CT Politics TV. I hope you'll return, and once we get into the session, and I like to do kind of a beginning of session, what we're working on, and then come back after the JF deadline there and see it again, and then hit it at the end as well.
Short session's coming.
It is. Yay!
Oh, no, that's my least favorite. Although I feel we should be a full-time legislature, so I'm one of the oddballs.
No, I think it should be a full-time job, because there's just so many issues, and out of all of them, so few actually come to fruition that it seems that more time would be a better thing.
Thousands filed, hundreds passed.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of summer here.
Yes. Happy Labor Day weekend, right?
That's right. No pumpkin spice till after Labor Day.
Not for me ever. Have a good
Me neither.
one.
Right? See, we agree.
We agree.
Thank you, Eleni. Wow, that was great. I haven't met Eleni before, but here again, you heard the story of how she came up, her family influences, her dad in labor, not having a child, but actually working for unions and negotiations and those types of things. and her mom, who was part of the stewardess union, and worked as volunteers in that. And then she came in when the COVID stuff was going on. They had to swear in out in the out in the back of the north lawn there, and that was a tough time to be in politics, to learn how stuff works. So it was nice to have her come on, and then also to share, you know, what she sees that Representative Corey had gone through in this unfortunate incident, which still is kind of bouncing around out there. And I think people need to kind of let some of that kind of stuff go and really look at the facts, because there was no doxing that happened. And he was just trying to relay basic information for people's safety to his district. So the lieutenant governor is going to be on next week and wants to follow up on that too. And we got some other people who wanted to come in and talk about it. So we'll get those perspectives as well. But thank you for watching CT Politics TV, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye now.
Thanks for watching CT Politics TV with political strategist Dan Newmeyer. Advertising opportunities are available. Want to be a guest or do a show? Contact us today. Find us on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire, or at ctpolitics.tv.